My perspective for writing this paper, which is still a work in progress, comes from the dual-fold fact that I am a Catholic cleric as a permanent deacon of the Archdiocese of Pretoria, but also a philosopher, and a philosopher before I was a cleric. So for Strathmore as a Catholic institution, I thought it would be a very good thing to look at it from these two perspectives. The reality is that the number of Catholic Christians in Africa increased from between 2018 and 2019 by over 33 million people. This makes our continent home to a significant proportion of the church. Oftentimes, however, indigenous belief systems appear to be in contradiction to Christianity. Indeed, this may certainly be the case when the church's dominant intellectual approach, Thomism, enters into consideration. Consequently, this tradition must enter into dialogue with the philosophical traditions of the peoples. To contribute toward the positive engagement between African philosophy and Thomism, this research will demonstrate a particular salient feature common in both traditions and enter into a comparison of the dynamics thereof, namely the importance of relationality for becoming human. In this encounter, the discussion will lead to the identification of points of contiguity, and in this way demonstrate that shared dimensions of philosophical discourse transcend accidental particularities. Before entering into the core of this research, it is relevant to consider the degree to which one can utilize Western discourse in situ in the African context without continuing to be part of the hegemonic narrative of oppression. Truthfully, the ideas of Western modernity have fed into the white project of systematic oppression in the forms of the constructions of the ideas of the West. Its unquestioned epistemic, economic, and moral superiority, and of biological racism, among others. Racism has become so ideologically ordinary in the West and her colonies, or former colonies, but there are still some. The roots of this injustice lie in the Enlightenment, whose scholars were simultaneously and sardonically also theorizing about human equality. At their crudest, such modern Western ideologies sought to remove the humanity of any person deemed out with modernity's narrow categorization of human. If one considers that these paradigms have contributed to the organized conquest and suppression of people throughout the world, then the entire Western epistemic system comes to lack credibility because of its taintedness as an instrument of domination. This naturally implies that within the decolonizing academic space, contestation and problematizations of validity must arise when Western ideologies and worldviews are propagated. So should the ideas of the colonial master still be taught, studied, and researched in our strange land, as Samantha Weiss once called South Africa? This is a question which any philosopher engaged in the pursuit of non-African philosophical discourse within the African context must grapple. Responding to this question gives both awareness of the historic problematic of epistemicide and proffers context to the comparative study that I seek to develop. Doing scholasticism, a supposedly entrenched Western philosophical paradigm, is itself an oddity separated by 8 centuries from the present context, which places the author frequently at the table of strangeness in the South African context. But South Africa is a strange place, occupied by people who are accidentally thoroughly diverse, to the non-purist extent that strangeness may be the ordinary way of being in this place. In a similar fashion, Thomism does not sit in juxtaposition to non-Western and decolonial philosophy, for its Neapolitan founder, St. Thomas Aquinas, utilized non-Western scholars in his work and was thoroughly influenced by Arabic philosophy in particular. Moreover, in its systematic conception by Aquinas, it predates modernity and any such modern philosophical distinctions determined from geographic or ethnic delineations. Further, this approach is enhanced in its embracing a polycentric epistemology, which at its roots considers philosophy qua philosophy, regardless of any philosophical theory's geographic or historic origins. Precisely because the Catholic tradition is a lived reality by indigenous African people on this African continent, engagement with its intellectual tradition by scholars who are versed in African philosophy can work towards the prevention of cognitive dissociation of African people who espouse Catholicism. Considering the identification of points of commonality between African philosophy and Thomism, as Schut perhaps most did, leads to the method of comparative philosophy as an appropriate methodological tool by which to enter this engagement. Comparative philosophy supposes that a plurality of philosophical perspectives rather than an hegemonic system is positive, since no philosophical tradition should be considered complete or be permitted to become dominant, whilst also recognizing the objective universality of human reason, regardless of tradition of origin. Comparative philosophy is a method by which aspects of philosophical traditions that are culturally different in their origins are brought into dialogue with one another to contribute to broader philosophical dialogue. Principally engaging in comparative philosophy must be undertaken with caution and sensitivity, particularly for Westerners, since our epistemic position is laden with privilege. Western epistemologies have been entrenched as the standard against which all knowledge must be compared. A further obvious difficulty is the problem of comparing concepts and structures that do not translate well between languages. Thence, if conceptual structures are to be acknowledged as significant qua themselves and not reduced or transformed, there can be no privileged epistemic position from which philosophical discourse is taken. An articulation will now be made of African philosophy's radix, the Southern African simultaneously multifaceted ontological, epistemological, and ethical category, Ubuntu. The focus will be on the personal relational dimensions thereof, with particular attention being given to the theme of becoming a person, which is the state of the human's being. The connotation that Ubuntu is a relational communitarian ethic has become dominant in the literature, obfuscating its radical meaning by this reduction to moral philosophy that has been augmented by the proliferation of applied ethics research, wherein Ubuntu has been employed and applied. However, Mogobe Ramose challenges these interpretations by drawing out the metaphysics in the etymology of the Nguni language term by dividing it into prefix and suffix, ubu and ntu. The prefix is the ontological dimension of the category, whereas the suffix is the epistemological aspect. Ubu refers to that which has the potential to be brought into existence and whichever tends toward concrete manifestation, to being, becoming. Ntu is what can be known through tangible means, that is that to which Ubu is always directed. 'Tis the person, umuntu, that has an irrevocable bond with Ubuntu, as the being able to uniquely reflect upon being becoming, on Ubu Ntu, in the experience of being. Ubu is inseparable from Umuntu. To quote Ramose, to be a human being is to affirm one's humanity by recognizing the humanity of others, and on that basis, establish human relationships with them. Ubuntu does have ethical bearing, even if the entirety of Ubuntu as the cornerstone of African philosophy cannot be reduced to moral philosophy alone. Within the community, Finos Mangena insists, the moral character formation of the moral agent presupposes interpersonal dialogical encounters, where through the being of one person grabs hold of the being of another in mutual recognition of humanity. The subject develops knowledge of their own being and the embeddedness of their being that is caught up with the being of others. But I contend, more importantly than the formulation of any systematic communitarian ethic through Ubuntu, is the experience of Ubuntu in the disclosure of personhood to personhood, the mutual recognition of personhood, and the living out of the interconnectedness between people. This way of being Ubuntu in the world reveals a motivation that Mpochivase proposes is the foundation that undergirds Ubuntu as a moral theory, not people per se, but impartial love, since the moral actions that Ubuntu must manifest transcend being concerned only for people that the moral agent knows or to whom one has kinship in some manner. Consequently, Chivase excludes the forms of love through friendship and romance, as these are selective and exclusionary. Thus, Chivase contends Ubuntu is not determined prior to the acting out of a loving action, which could potentially restrict the act. Chivase attempts to disentangle, as a consequence, the human from Ubuntu, such that the meaning of Ubuntu would stand, to quote her, even when no one aspires to or champions it, or even when no community benefits from it. I query whether without the agent of love, that is the human being, that whether disinterested or biased love can be contended to exist at all. Moreover, if Ubuntu is articulated in terms of Abantu, is the concept separable from the human to stand even without the active involvement of the moral agent? The metaphysical system that undergirds Ubuntu, in the metaphysical system that undergirds Ubuntu, Ubu is essential to Ubuntu in Abantu being bound up with the metaphysical Umvelikangi and even participating in the being of Umvelikangi. Ngobane explains, way back in infinity was Umvelikangi, the first to appear, who was neither matter nor visible. He was eternal and creative. He was the ultimate reality. All were manifestations of his infinite form. The relationship between Umvelikangi and Ntu emphasizes that the good life incorporates a vision of understanding and a living out, that the other forms a part of oneself. If the human being is a manifestation of Umvelikangi by sharing in his essence, by being in relationship with another person, the person's being is properly ordered to the relational nature of reality. It is in this state of being, of relational personhood, that the person becomes a person when loving and living through Ubuntu. It is uncontentious to propose that relationality is universal to the nature of the human. One form of relationality is friendship. Perhaps inspired by the philosopher Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas gave considerable attention to the habit of friendship in his Summa. In the Aristotelian conception, friendship is utilitarian, in that it is akin to a habit-forming virtue, which contributes towards the moral agent, the thinking subject, living a good life. But Aquinas' definition of friendship is directly related to charity, caritas, love. Considering objections to this conjunction, Aquinas notes that if charity pertains to the relationship between God and angels, it follows that charity is not friendship between people. Furthermore, if it is the case that one is expected to love one's enemies, who are logically not one's friends, one cannot bind charity to friendship either. Finally, if friendship is to be conceived as a virtue, then it follows that friendship cannot be related to charity, because charity infers a love of the unvirtuous. Consequently, love does not necessarily relate to friendship, so Aquinas' interlocutors would have it. But in response to the severing of love and friendship, Aquinas argues that benevolent love that yearns for the good of the loved one undergirds friendship. This differs from the selfish love that one would have when desiring only the good of self and not the good of others, because it is not for the sake of utility. So paramount is love that an indispensable component to friendship is mutuality, the reciprocal sense of love whereby both friends in a relationship desire one another's good. For mutuality, communicative encounters, interpersonal interaction between friends are necessary, and for this engagement to be effective, charity, caritas, must be present. The charitable love between friends is pivotal for friendship that brings about meaningful ends between those who are friends. It follows then, according to Aquinas, that charity is friendship. Aquinas argues that a relational sense of friendship between all people arises precisely because of the divine engagement in the caritas that brings about friendship. Whilst the form of friendship described is direct, Aquinas posits that friendship can also transcend relationships. All people are effectively friends with one another through the loving relationship with the divine. If we love God as a friend, and if God loves all God's creation as friends, it logically follows that we love all out of charity in relation to God. For whether the particular person is virtuous or not, they are loved by God and consequently should be loved by all too. With a charitable outlook, the friend can recognize in another both the good of themselves and the good of the other. In the encounter with the friend, the subject comes to recognize some good that they can achieve. Aquinas argues, for in the action of the virtue of love, a teleological good is brought about. In loving another, the friend who is loved is conceived as an end, so inferring that that person is a good in their own right. In loving friendship, there is hence a recognition of the innate dignity inherent in the one loved. In friendship, one desires the fulfillment of the ends of all friends, because all love for Aquinas is unitive. Friendship potentially redeems itself through two types of union between the lover and the loved. The first, real union, is the proximate union between the two that is the product of desire. The second, a form of meta-union, is defined as affective love. That is, when a formal cognitive apprehension is made of the unity between the lover and the loved. The love that exists between friends naturally leads the friends to recognize the unity between them. Thomistically, a friend is redefined as neither a fleeting associate nor just another being separate from the soul. Instead, a friend is one whose very self is extended into the being of the lover and the being of the other into the being of the self, to the degree that one's friend becomes another part of the self as an effect of the unitive love of friendship. This unitive dimension is fundamental to friendship because love always seeks to unite, with the consequence that without unity, love is not. Thus, in the affective experience, the one who loves experiences the joy and happiness, the pain and the sorrow of their friend because of their mutual indwelling. The ultimate reason that any person needs friends, in truth, deflects away from the needs of the befriender. Friendship is needed for the operative sake of living and enabling the good of both the loved and the lover by doing good to them. Friendship, so cast, operates teleologically for the sake of the other, such that their own end can be met, and in this way that the friend who lives her good is able to be happy. In mutual indwelling with another in friendship, both persons are able to move closer to their good. Being in friendship, therefore, implies that the person is ever in a state of becoming more human, since it is partly through friendship that the telos of the human person can be brought into being. Within this research, I have attempted to reconstruct the African philosophical dynamic of Ubuntu as relational personhood and the Thomistic account of mutual indwelling. These accounts both emphasize relationality to be at the core of human being, qua human, even to the similar extent of considering unity between people as the good of relationality. This juxtaposition between the particular dimensions of two philosophical schools has not been an attempt at hermeneutic fusion, but rather serves as an opportunity to consider some points of congruence as well as divergence between them related to the theme. There is a degree of discontinuity between these traditions, revolving particularly around the theme of friendship, where Thomism would consider friendship as vital for mutual indwelling, while some approaches to Ubuntu, in particular that of Chivase, would consider friendship to be a hindrance to the actualization of human being. In terms of congruence, the following themes are identified as points of intersection between African philosophy in Ubuntu and the Thomist notion of friendship in mutual indwelling. Firstly, both African philosophy's relational personhood and Thomism's mutual indwelling have their origins in metaphysics. This idea Schut touches on fairly well, not in considerable detail relating to interpersonal relationships, but more as a general comparison between Thomism and African philosophy. And secondly, in both traditions, it is through relationality that the human being becomes. I will leave it there so that I don't carry on beyond my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I would like to invite any questions from the audience, if there are any.
Hi, Callum. Nice to see you there. A small, very small question. I just want to know, well, what Ubuntu can add to, if there is anything, to the idea of Aristotelian friendship or that one of Aquinas, or and vice versa. Is something Aquinas add, probably the metaphysic point of view? Just a few words to distinguish, to see how both can be improved, or what do you think about that?
Thanks, Juan Carlos. I didn't go into very great detail in the development of how the one might be improved from the other, because I was limiting it to looking at points of congruity or congruence. But perhaps there is a very real sense that the personal in Ubuntu and the actual acknowledgement through living out Ubuntu of recognizing the humanity of the other is less abstract than it would be in friendship in the Aristotelian sense, or even in the Thomistic sense. Somehow in Ubuntu there's a sense of more of real relationships between people, of really being touched by other people and really acknowledging the humanity of the other person. That's less distant and less theorized. That I would take as a positive. The other would be the lived experience. I'm not sure how many people in the world would say, I embrace Aristotelian ideas of friendship or Thomistic notions of friendship as a foundation for my life. but certainly the lived experience living in Africa among African people is that the sense of relationality is very, very actual, even if it might not be theorized about on the ground. So I think that in that sense, Ubuntu has a challenge to offer these paradigms that have origin in the West. Yeah, let me leave it there. Thank you for that question.